Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Margaret Barker. And today's live stream is going to be based on two books that she wrote, The Lover of the Lord and The Great Lady, Restoring Her Story. The links to purchase both of these books will be in the description below and also in the pinned comment below that. That being said, Margaret, thank you very much for joining me today. And I'm going to get started with this first question, kind of a little bit of a recap for those that have no idea who Asherah is. So, Margaret, can you tell us who Asherah is for those that don't know about her?
Well, Asherah is a name that's only found in the Hebrew scriptures, and it's an invented name. It's the name that was given to the female divine figure in the Jerusalem temple, but it wasn't her real name. And when the Jewish scribes at the Second Temple wanted to put this part of their past well and truly behind them, they changed the name slightly, just a letter, in order to obscure her real name. Possibly they didn't want to have the real name actually in scripture because it was the name of a deity or a divine figure that they didn't want to remember. And so Asherah is the name by which the lady is found in the Hebrew Bible. But if you look at the inscriptions, the graffiti that have been found from the First Temple period, the graffiti that haven't been through the hands of an editor, you find that her name is Ashratah. That might not be the correct pronunciation, but it has this extra T at the end. And it looks as though that was her name. I shall refer to her as Ashratah. There's been a lot of debate about these inscriptions, these graffiti, because some people wanted to say, well, actually it means his Asherah. And other people have said, well, no, you don't put his with a person's name, a proper name in Hebrew. It can't be that. And so they thought Asherah might mean a pole. And so she was some sort of fertility symbol. She was just a pole. You have all sorts of strange translations. Some people thought she was a sacred grove. If you read the old Bibles, the King James Version, the authorized one, the very old English translations, she comes under all sorts of names. But these were translations made before they had these discoveries in the Judean desert from the time, well, they're dated usually from the time of Isaiah, the great Isaiah, sort of 700 BC, something like that. And I suspect that the great prophet Isaiah knew this female divine figure and knew her as Ashratah.
What does Isaiah say about the Great Lady?
Well, he doesn't name her with that name, but one of the fascinating things about recovering the Great Lady, and that's my name for her, one of the fascinating things about recovering the Great Lady is that she had many, many titles. And this doesn't mean that there was a whole host of female divine figures in the First Temple. She was a great lady with many, many titles. And the first title that we find for her in Isaiah is the Virgin. And so when you have the famous prophecy that's used as a prophecy of the birth of Jesus in Isaiah chapter 7, that says quite clearly, the Virgin shall conceive and bear a son and call his name Emmanuel. And some of the translations are rather careless, and they don't say the Virgin. The is quite clearly there. They say a virgin or even a young woman. And these are not true to the original Hebrew tradition. So she is the Virgin. And she first appears in Isaiah chapter 7. And interestingly, in this chapter, there is a very clear different text that's been found among the Qumran scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls. You probably know that there's a complete scroll of Isaiah has been found, which is almost exactly the same as the text of Isaiah that we have in the Hebrew Bible today. One or two differences, just a letter here or there, but some of those letters are very significant indeed. And there is one different letter in Isaiah chapter 7. And when Isaiah is speaking to the king, he says to him, ask a sign from the Lord your God. And that's what the current Hebrew text says. But the Qumran text says, ask a sign from the mother of the Lord your God. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. And in context, it looks as though the virgin, the great lady of that title, is the mother of the Lord. And this is where I differ from I think most Old Testament scholars who are working in this area of the Divine Lady. They say things like, she is the wife, God's wife. Did God have a wife? It's a very famous book, very nice, very good book actually, by William Dever. Did God have a wife? And the answer is no. The Lord has a mother, and the mother of the Lord is the basis of all that later Christian imagery applied to the Virgin Mary as the mother of Jesus. And it doesn't work if she's the wife. So Isaiah knows this great lady, and that's in the earliest part of the prophecies. And then later on, he equates her, later on in the book, possibly written by one of his disciples 2 or 3 generations later, we don't know for certain. She is the city of Jerusalem personified. And so when the prophet is speaking to the people and saying Jerusalem will be built, it had been destroyed by the Babylonians 597, 586. When he's saying the city will be rebuilt, he addresses the city and says, arise, put on your lovely garments, get up out of the dust. You are not, a fallen princess. You're not all these things. He speaks to the lady as though she is the city. And that is a very interesting and curious phenomenon, because in the book of Revelation, when she appears towards the end, the great lady comes down from heaven, and St. John describes her as a city, the heavenly city, the city with, the golden streets and then the walls of jasper and the river of life flowing from it. So she's try to imagine this divine lady as just a divine figure limits very much what we can say about her. She personified the city. She's sometimes called Daughter of Jerusalem or Daughter of Zion. It's the same figure. And Isaiah has a great deal to say about the great lady. In fact, one of the most fascinating things about her, and I've got an RSV here, I can't remember the exact verses, so I will have to look it up. Yes, when Justin Martyr, who was a Christian teacher in the middle of the 2nd century, he was martyred, I think, in 166 AD. And when he was asked which bits of the Old Testament, which bits of the Hebrew Bible summed up the Christian message, the Christian position, he gave as his 3 chapters Isaiah 52, 53, and 54. Now, if you were to ask most Christians today, particularly Protestant Christians, Isaiah 52 starts with the suffering servant who bears the sins, and eventually he justifies people, and the suffering servant. And that's familiar to all Protestants. But the idea that chapter 54 of Isaiah is also a prophecy of Christianity comes as quite a surprise. And chapter 54 is all about the great lady who has had no children for a very long time, but she's told to enlarge her tent because she's going to have a lot more children. Now, in Justin, something like 100 years after the beginning of Christianity, could see the suffering servant as the prophecy of our Lord. And then the barren woman who hadn't had any children recently as a prophecy of the rebirth of the church. Sing, O barren one who did not bear, break forth into singing and cry aloud, etc., etc. The idea that the great lady is going to return with the Christians is something that, well, Catholics wouldn't find this at all difficult, and certainly Orthodox Christians wouldn't, but Protestants, people who are the children of the Reformation, would find the idea of the lady, the mother of the Lord, really quite disturbing. And yet she was there from the beginning, in the days before the church was divided. The great lady is there. And because Jesus was recognized as the Lord incarnate, Mary, his mother, very soon was honored with all the titles of the great lady of the temple. And it's very remarkable. If you look in the earliest prayers, the earliest hymns to Mary, and I was brought up as a good, very fundamentalist Protestant. And I was told firmly that all this stuff that Catholics sing about Mary, goodness knows where does that come from? It's certainly not in the Bible. Well, of course, I was taught wrongly. It is in the Bible. It's just there under another name. So Isaiah says a great deal about the great lady, and this passes straight into the earliest known Christian use of the book of Isaiah.
Does the book of Ezekiel refer to the great lady?
Oh, yes, indeed. Now, Ezekiel was a temple priest, and we're looking now almost a century or so after the time of the first great Isaiah. And Ezekiel had a vision of the lady leaving her temple, which had become polluted, so polluted that she couldn't stay any longer. And Ezekiel he describes this vision twice. We have it in chapter 1, and that's actually the second vision. So I don't know why the book was put together in that order. There must have been a reason. And then we have it again in chapters 8 to 10. And Ezekiel sees the great throne that had been in the Holy of Holies in the temple. He sees it rising up. It's the throne in the temple wasn't a chair, it was a chariot. And so he sees the great wheels rising up, and he uses language that's almost impossible to translate, possibly because he was lost for words. He was having this overwhelming vision of the divine presence leaving the temple. And if you read a translation, say Ezekiel chapter 1, which describes the throne chariot, if you read a translation that makes sense, then you're reading a bad translation. But if you read a translation that's all bits and here and there and sentences breaking off, and is it a singular, is it a plural, if you're reading a really fragmented translation, it's probably true to the original. And what Ezekiel sees in his vision is the living one, or the source of life, the Chaya. Now, Chaya means living, and the plural, Chayot, again, living. And living creatures, living beings, we don't know. The plural was often used as a sign of reverence or respect for a deity. So singular and plural is no problem. But when some translations, for example, Catholic translations, describe Chaya as an animal, which it can be, but it is unlikely to be an animal in this particular context. And so when you read translations that talk about animal or animals, they have missed an extraordinary glimpse of the great lady, and she has the Lord, her son, enthroned upon her. And you see Ezekiel describes how this great throne, who is in some way the lady, and she brings her son, who is the Lord, and she takes him out of the temple and she takes him across to Babylon, where the people have gone in exile. Now, if you think of the number of pictures and statues that Christians have of Mary sitting with the child in her lap, and she is actually a representation of the throne. And you find these images coming all the way through. The great lady is certainly there in Ezekiel. Last, she's translated as animals, which is unfortunate to say the least. But this is the Holy of Holies, as Ezekiel the priest knew it around 600 BC. And he knew it was too impure for the lady to stay any longer. Now, he had another vision, this is at the end of his prophecies, of the glory of the Lord returning. And the glory of the Lord is coming back, and he said it's exactly like the one I saw leaving and going to Babylon, to the river Kibar. And the glory of the Lord comes back, and it comes back from the Mount of Olives, and it comes in through the eastern gate of the temple, and the glory fills the temple. And this is the Lord and his mother returning, just described as the glory. Now, we have recently been celebrating Palm Sunday, like a couple of weeks ago. And if you follow the route Jesus took on Palm Sunday, when he came down the Mount of Olives and up through and in through the eastern gate of the temple, he was following the route of the glory returning to the temple. And that is hugely important. And the people who met him and waved palms and greeted him as the king, they knew what they were doing. This was an active prophecy. This was Jesus returning, and the prophecy was that he was returning with his mother. Again, that's something that we've just simply lost.
Did the early Christians think that Mary was the physical incarnation of Ashratah?
I suspect they didn't say it in those words, but the logic is that if Jesus was the incarnation of Yahweh, the Lord, then Mary was the incarnation of the Lord's mother. If you are being strictly logical, now theology is not a logical discipline. I'm the first to know that. But the great honor that was given to Mary suggests that this tradition of the mother of the Lord passed into Christianity.
Is the lady the tree of life?
The lady's greatest symbol is the tree of life. If we're being strictly accurate about the way we talk, she is represented by the tree of life. And when you reject the lady, as in the story of Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve chose the forbidden tree and discovered too late that they no longer had access to the tree of life. And one of the wonderful things about the book of Revelation, in the letters at the beginning, chapters 2 and 3 in the book of Revelation, one of the things that the heavenly Lord promises to St. John in his vision, he says, the faithful Christians will have access again to the tree of life, and everything that meant. Now, the tree of life was a symbol that embraced all sorts of aspects of the tradition of the great lady. The oil from the tree of life was perfumed, and the tradition was that the oil from the tree of life was imitated in the earthly temple by the perfumed anointing oil that was used to anoint the kings and the high priests. So they received the essence of the tree of life. Then the leaves of the tree of life, according to the book of Revelation, they're for healing. And one of the great lady's attributes is that she heals. The branches of the tree of life were the scepters of the kings. There's a lovely lament in the book of Ezekiel, which describes her as not as the tree of life, but as a vine. And she was uprooted and cast out into the desert. And there were no more branches to be scepters for rulers. She would have no more royal kings who were her sons, her heavenly sons. And so the tree of life and all the aspects of the tree of life, the branches, the stem. Remember, Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches, John chapter 15. All these tree images, very, very important. And I'm pretty certain that the tree of life in the actual temple was represented by the 7-branch candlestick, because that has so much tree imagery associated with it. But as with all these things, we can ask far more questions than there is evidence to answer them. We have to do the best we can with what has survived. And it's amazing how much has survived. So the tree of life is the menorah. Many people have said this, and I am convinced by this. And so the tree of life is also a tree of light. And the tree of life is restored to the Holy of Holies in the temple right at the end of the book of Revelation, the very last chapter. The tree of life is there again. And the tree of life removed from the temple was a sign of the lady being removed. So she's closely associated with the tree of life. The book of Proverbs actually says, it's Proverbs chapter 3. There's a lovely poem towards the end of the chapter describing wisdom, and it says, she is a tree of life to those who grasp hold of her. And that's quite clear. That's the only clear reference in the Hebrew scriptures, but it's there. She is a tree of life to those who grasp hold of her. So the tree of life is very, very important picture of the lady.
Does the Gospel of the Hebrews refer to the Great Mother?
Well, yes, it does. Unfortunately, most of the Gospel of the Hebrews doesn't survive. It only survives in quotations. And some of those quotations are very, very interesting. I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but at Jesus's baptism, we are told that the voice that spoke to him was his mother. His mother, the Holy Spirit, speaks to him at his baptism, and she recognizes him as her son. And then later on, and we don't have this in the Gospel of the Hebrews, but we apply the same imagery when you get to the account of the Transfiguration. And the 3 disciples are on the mountaintop with Jesus, and he is transfigured and becomes a shining figure before them. There is a bright cloud there, and there is a voice from the bright cloud that actually speaks to the disciples and says to them, this is my son, listen to him. So Jesus was proclaimed to be the spokesman, the teacher who taught on behalf of his mother. And so this voice is another way that you recognize the great lady. In the Hebrew scriptures, you often have a voice speaking to Ezekiel, a voice from heaven, a voice this, a voice that. And a voice in Hebrew is the word kol, and it's a masculine noun. And so the verb afterwards is also a masculine form of the verb. And so it gets translated, there was a voice from heaven, and he said. But we don't know that the voice was a masculine voice. It should be translated, there was a voice from heaven, and it said. And it is possible in various contexts, and you have to look at each context in its own, on its own merit, that this unnamed voice that's heard throughout the Hebrew scriptures is actually her voice. It comes through in the Gospels, and we have this lovely clue in the Gospel of the Hebrews that the voice at the baptism was his mother, and so the voice at the transfiguration would also have been the mother. And it's little clues like this which enable us to begin to piece together bit by bit this incredibly important and almost lost female figure from Solomon's temple, which is where, of course, it originated. She suffered, of course, at the hands of the later scribes who felt that this was a blasphemy that they couldn't possibly have in scripture and so on. And so her name was changed. There are other changes. It's a very, very subtle process of editing that went on. But they couldn't edit people's community memories. And so many people who preserved these memories probably didn't read anyway. And it is extraordinary how many of the memories of the great lady, the mother of the Lord, and then all the titles used for her suddenly appear almost as a job lot. You know, the whole lot, they're all there, and they appear in early Christian prayers, hymns to Mary, all sorts of things. And you could say, you know, there was a research group set up and they thought these would be nice things to say about Mary. That's very unlikely. Much more likely is that the ordinary people remembered that these were the images for and the pictures of and the ways to honor the great lady, the mother of the Lord.
Does the book of Jeremiah say anything about the great lady?
He does, but only by implication. The call of Jeremiah in chapter 1, Jeremiah sees an almond branch that has been broken off. And he sees the almond branch, and the Lord says to Jeremiah, "What do you see?" "I see an almond branch. I am watching," says the Lord. Now, an almond branch was the sign of the old priesthood. It was the branch from the almond tree, which was, of course, what the menorah represented. And Jeremiah is seeing a vision of someone who was the almond branch, perhaps the king or the royal high priest. It would be the same person in his time. And he is in danger. And Jeremiah receives assurance that the Lord is watching over his work. So there are hints like this throughout the book of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is called, of course, to resist what's going on. The lady being expelled from the temple. You know, chapter 1, it says, "I'm calling you to stand against the rulers of this land. I'm going to make you like a fortified city," and all these words of encouragement that the prophet receives. So yes, the lady is there. She's there in other ways as well, but Jeremiah's text is very, very complicated, and it's not one to deal with in a couple of passing remarks. But yes, the great lady in danger is there in the call of Jeremiah in chapter 1.
Does the book of Revelation refer to the great lady?
Oh yes, she is the centerpiece. If you look at the book of Revelation and you take off the bits that were obviously added for the second edition before it was finally finished, so you start counting at the beginning of chapter 4 and leave off the introduction and the 7 letters, because those are a separate collection, and you then leave off the last part of chapter 22, because those are fragments of early oracles that are just kept there, and you then work through what is left. you find that the exact center scene of the book of Revelation is Revelation chapter 12. Now, the chapter division in Revelation at this point is not very helpful. Of course, the chapter divisions were put in much, much later. They're not in the original text at all. And chapter 12 actually starts at the end of chapter 11. And I've got my Bible here. The end of chapter 11 in Revelation, God's temple in heaven was opened. The ark of his covenant was seen again within the temple. There were flashes of lightning, voices, peals of thunder, earthquake, heavy hail, and a great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet. The woman clothed with the sun, that is the exact center of the book of Revelation. She is the main thing. And the vision is the lady of the temple giving birth to her son. And he is snatched up to heaven, so he's safe. And the woman has to escape from the red dragon. Now, the red dragon is a thinly coded way of describing the hostile priests of the second temple, particularly the high priests, those who had employed the editors who removed the lady from the scriptures, and those who had developed Judaism in a different way. They had developed a Judaism emphasizing only the Moses part of it. Moses was there in the first temple, obviously, but he didn't have the huge emphasis that he had in the second temple. And so they emphasized one part, and I would go so far as to say distorted in the process. And the lady was put to one side, pushed out, and she fled to the desert, and she fled to the wilderness, and there she survived. She survived for a very long time. The disciples, the devotees of the great lady, had their own place of exile, and it wasn't Babylon. They went somewhere into the region of what is now southern Jordan, or maybe North Arabia, somewhere like that. And there, the devotees of the lady kept her traditions alive. We've got very interesting texts, Syriac texts about this. They kept the traditions alive, and they waited until the time for the prophecy to be fulfilled. And then one year, they saw a star, and that star was the sign they'd been looking for. And the faithful disciples of the lady, who we know in Matthew's gospel as the Magi, came to find Jesus. And so this prophecy of the woman giving birth to the royal child and then fleeing into the desert was not something new in the time of St. John. It was an old prophecy, it was an old coded indication, if you like, of where the lady and the traditions and teachings and expectations about her son were actually kept alive. And they just have this walk-on part in Matthew's gospel. He doesn't tell us even how many magi there were, but he gives it all away when he says that they brought three gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And gold was symbolic of wisdom, the heavenly wisdom. Frankincense was what the true high priest was entitled to offer, and nobody else. And myrrh was the myrrh oil, the dominant fragrance, the dominant ingredient, if you like, of the anointing oil. And so gold, frankincense, and myrrh were the symbols of Solomon's temple and symbols of the return of the temple, in which there was a place for the lady and her son. And then we have the final vision in the book of Revelation, which is in chapter 22. It's a lovely one. We have the river of life flowing out again from the temple, and the water of life is another of the symbols of the work of the lady. The lady is described as a flowing stream and her water not only brings literal fertility, but her water is wisdom, and it irrigates and illuminates the human mind. And so she's often called the Holy Wisdom. And many great Christian churches are dedicated to the Holy Wisdom, especially in the Orthodox world in the East. So the lady is there under so many different titles. She's there throughout the book of Revelation, if you know what you are looking for. Hugely important. Well, missing person, really, in most of the ways that people are reading the Bible.
Can you tell us a little bit about Pythagoras and Plato alluding to the Great Lady?
Well, I can try. In Plato's tractate, the Timaeus, he asks one of his companions, whose name is Timaeus, to hold forth, which he does. Now, Timaeus is introduced as a follower of Pythagoras. And Pythagoras, if you go back to the story of his origins, and this story was written down centuries later, but I think it has a kernel of truth. Pythagoras, as a young man, traveled from Asia Minor with his father, who was a merchant who traded with Tyre and Sidon. He traded with that eastern Mediterranean coast. And the story is that Pythagoras went and actually spent some time as a young man in the province called Syria, which includes what we would now call Israel-Palestine. And the story, remember this is written down a long time later, is that Pythagoras learnt when he was living in Syria he learned from priests of a temple. Now, if you do calculations as to when Pythagoras might have been there, it would have been after the first temple was destroyed and the priests were driven out and scattered. And the question we can't answer, we'd love to be able to answer, is did Pythagoras learn things from those priests from Solomon's temple? Now, why is this a possibility? Well, when Timaeus is expounding his theory of everything, he describes someone called the living being. And the living being, you remember, living being, living one, is what Ezekiel saw leaving the temple. So Ezekiel would have been one of that generation of priests, some of whom were scattered. Ezekiel went to Babylon, some of whom were scattered, some of whom could have met the young Pythagoras. And there is no precedent for this living creature that Timaeus describes. And it's a sort of circular thing, which reminds you of the wheels of the chariot that went round and round. Remember, Ezekiel's chariot is untranslatable. And there are all sorts of things that Timaeus says about the living creature that fit perfectly with what Ezekiel says about the living one. Now, caveat, beware. Pythagoras' teaching is mostly handed on secondhand, and it's a very ancient form of Greek. Ezekiel's description is full of technical priestly terms, and some of it's virtually untranslatable. But putting all that aside, if you match up Ezekiel's strange description and Timaeus's even stranger description, it is very likely indeed that what Timaeus learned from Pythagoras had learned from priests who had served with Ezekiel. And then if you apply this more widely to teachings attributed to Pythagoras, you find a huge number of correspondences. The way he describes the center of the earth, the way he describes the divine beings, so much of it corresponds with what we can reconstruct of Solomon's temple. So, did Pythagoras, did Plato know the first temple? The answer is almost certainly yes. The ancient world was happy to say that the ancient Greeks drew from the temple. There's a bishop called Eusebius who was writing in the early 300s in Palestine, and he wrote a massive work of showing how there were elements in Greek culture and tradition which matched up with elements in Hebrew tradition, and that the Hebrew tradition historically was older, and he therefore argued that the Greek tradition had drawn from the Hebrew. That's a very famous, it's called Preparation for the Gospel. It's a very long book, 10 volumes. But he had plenty of material to draw on. So we can say that the Great Lady spread far and wide, and she spread with the dispersion that was caused by the great catastrophe when the Babylonians destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, 597 BC.
The last thing I want to ask you about before we get to the audience questions, what does the Enochic literature say about the Great Lady when Enoch goes up into the heavens? Does he encounter her?
No, he doesn't. But there's a strange poem embedded in the section of Enoch that's called the Parables. And this describes how wisdom was rejected on earth. So she went back up to heaven and took her seat among the angels, and a replacement came down who was not a nice lady at all, and she was received and welcomed. And that is a very unsubtle way of saying that wisdom was rejected and was replaced by something else, which non-biblical texts refer to as Madame Folly. Her followers are known as the foolish people, things like that. And you don't have to be very bright to work out that the foolish people are the opposite of the wise ones. So there are little fragments embedded in Enoch which support the idea. You see, Enoch includes within it, in one of the later sections, Enoch's an anthology, 5 main sections. And in one of the later sections, you have embedded a fragment of an enigmatic history. It was called the Weeks, and each era of history is a week. And in the 5th week, things start going badly wrong in the temple. And the people who live in the temple, so that's the priests, they reject wisdom and their eyes become closed. And when they reject wisdom, they lose all the gifts of wisdom, so the gifts of vision and so forth. And then in the 6th week, that's the next era of history, another group come back and they rebuild the temple, but it's an impure temple, and they were apostates. They were not true to the original faith. Now, that clearly is a biased account of history, but it's an account that exists. There were people, the Enoch tradition, who regarded the developments of the Second Temple as an apostasy from the true faith. And the main difference between the Second Temple and the First Temple was that the First Temple had the lady, the Second Temple did not have the lady, and the Christians who saw themselves as restoring the true temple, if If you read the first letter of Peter, you'll find that there. They restore the lady. So there are all sorts of bits of evidence. If you collect them and join them together, they do make a fairly powerful case.
All right. So let's take a look at the super chats first. Super chat questions will have priority. Efficient High, thank you for your super chat. Is Revelation 12:14 about Mary's flight to Pella?
It could have been applied to that, certainly, but the original vision is, I think, much older and describes the great lady and her devotees fleeing from the temple in Jerusalem. Originally in the time of Isaiah, more joined them in the time of Jeremiah. But these prophecies shaped the way people thought, and Mary's flight into the wilderness could well have been a description of the early Christians. You see, there is that prophecy in Revelation. Where is it? Revelation 18, verse 4, a voice from heaven, come out of her, Jerusalem, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plague. Her sins are heaped high as heaven. God has remembered her iniquities. So the Christians certainly looked to prophecies, that was perhaps a new prophecy, as the reason for their leaving Jerusalem. They could well have seen Mary, seen this as the flight to Pella. We just don't know.
Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. I've never heard of God having a mother. Is this acceptable to scholars today?
Well, I don't care what scholars think today, actually. They were happy to toy with the idea of God having a wife, and that is now quite widely accepted. But in fact, the prophetic tradition is that the lady in question was not the wife, but the mother, and that passes into Christian imagery. So, in fact, one of the great titles of Mary in the Orthodox tradition is Mother of God, Theotokos. So, God having a mother is something that will be an everyday phrase for someone who has been brought up as an Orthodox Christian, Greek or Russian or whatever.
Ronald Big Money Anderson, thank you for your super chat. I just love your show and the guests you have. Keep up the good work. Well, thank you, Ronald.
Well, thank you very much. It's hard work as well.
All right, so that's it for the super chats for now. So there is another question I did see earlier. Here it is. Rayon, thank you for your super chat. It's not a super chat. Thank you for your question. Why would you think that the writer of Revelation has a map and or guide to what for why?
It's not so much a map or a guide. He has the writer, or the compiler, I should say, St. John, has a structure. He puts things into sevens, and these all have a meaning. And he puts the lady giving birth to her son right in the middle, and that's because she's center stage. What she's doing, what John is doing when he collects all these visions and puts them in this particular order, is that he is doing the job that Jesus entrusted to him. Now, I wrote a long commentary 25 years ago on the book of Revelation, and I read the text, the Greek text, absolutely literally. And the Greek text begins by saying, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him, Jesus, to show to his servants what must soon take place. And so the title of the book says that these were the visions that Jesus had, and that they were entrusted to St. John, the beloved disciple, and he was entrusted to assemble them and make them known together with such interpretation as had, or fulfillment as had happened to the church as the visions were fulfilled. And so you have them put together in groups of seven. You have the seven seals, you have the seven trumpets, the seven vessels of wrath, and so on. It's all a highly structured thing, but it was to show the first Christians how the ancient prophecies and the ancient visions known to Jesus were actually being fulfilled in their own time. Now, the book of Revelation is usually treated as a prophecy of the remote future. Most of it, as far as I can see, was prophecies of the first generations of the Christians that were finally fulfilled when Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. You know, see, the harlot who burns in Revelation 19 is Jerusalem burning. And Jerusalem was destroyed. Jesus predicted it would be destroyed. The beginning of Holy Week, you see these stones, not one shall be left upon another. And early Christian pilgrims used to go to the site of the temple in Jerusalem and say, look, the prophecies of Jesus came true. And the book of Revelation, by its own, in its own words, Revelation chapter 1, verse 1 says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him, Jesus, to show his servants what must soon take place. And Jesus had these visions and he knew what was coming. John was the editor and the publisher.
Fishner Tai, thank you for your super chat. Were the Essenes Enochian Jews? Is there a relationship between Enochic Judaism and the Jesus movement? This could explain their feelings of the temple.
Oh, that is about 2 hours of lecture there. We don't know how the Essenes related to the Christians. We don't know how they related to the Jews. One of the big mysteries is why the Essenes aren't mentioned in the New Testament. They're not. And yet they were a very powerful and influential group at the time. Is there a relationship between Enochic Judaism and the Jesus movement? Yes, in many ways, but I would be very wary of calling it Enochic Judaism. The Enoch traditions, Judaism, by their own definition, they define themselves very carefully. And Josephus, himself a Jew, high priestly family, in his writing says that Jew was the name by which the people were known who came back from Babylon. They were a particular group, the returned exiles, who put great emphasis on the law of Moses, and they developed what we recognize as Second Temple Judaism. I think the people who preserved the Enoch traditions would not have called themselves Jews. I think they would have called themselves Hebrews or maybe something else. But I can be pretty certain they would not have called themselves or their traditions Judaism. It's a very difficult area. I mean, people nowadays are talking about Judaisms, plural, but I think that is loose talk. Josephus tells us that, the Jews were very careful about who, if you like, use their name. They were the tradition that had come back from the exile. They had rebuilt the temple. They had preserved the law of Moses, they expounded it, lived by it, all the rest of it. They produced this, what we recognize as Judaism. But I don't think they would have been very happy to think that there were half a dozen other varieties of Judaism who hadn't preserved things as they had done and who'd gone off and done all sorts of other things. Whereas the people who were doing these other things were saying, who do these people from Babylon think they are? Because they have left behind so many of the old traditions that we are preserving. So I think you've got to be very careful how you use the term Judaism. Enochic tradition is fine. people of the Enochic tradition. So who were they? What were they doing? Who were the Essenes? Answer to all those questions, we don't know what we'd like to. So much of the evidence was destroyed in the Great Wars of Rome, 17132 to 35. And so much is just speculation.
Ryan Kotastic, thank you for your super chat. What is your best argument against apologists who say Asherah worship is idolatry, from an admirer of the divine feminine, though not a believer?
Asherah worship is no more idolatry than anything else. Recognizing the divine feminine is not idolatry. Refusing to recognize the divine feminine is patriarchy, which is equally a sin. Asherah worship, we're not looking at Asherah worship, we're looking at rediscovering the lady who was remembered and honored as the mother of the Lord. It's not idolatry. That's the sort of thing that I was told in my very Protestant youth about Catholics who made statues of Mary. And for a long time, I believed that. But I think we've got new evidence now, and we need to see what is there. We haven't got enough for a complete picture, but we do have enough to know that the picture we have been given, the traditional picture, is far from adequate.
Chuck KV, thank you for super chat. Isaiah 7:14, does the L ending of Emmanuel imply that her son is one of the divine assembly, and that she is therefore the mother of the assembly?
Emmanuel means with us. Emmanuel is with us, and Ale, God with us. And so whoever was the son of the Virgin was the human presence of God with his people. And the Davidic kings were believed to be angel figures, if you like. Psalm 89, he shall cry to me, Father, and I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. That's the middle of Psalm 89. Most of the great angels have El at the end of his name, and they are just aspects of the presence of God. Raphael is the healing of God, the archangel. That's how Raphael is. Uriel is the illumination, the intellectual illumination. Uriel just means the light of God. Gabriel is the strength of God, and so on. So you have a lot of these names ending EL, and they just mean aspects of the presence of God.
So that is it for the super chats for now. There was a question I saw earlier. I'll try to pull that up real quick. Here it is. Henry Lamb, thank you for your question. Dr. Barker has mentioned that the imagery of the temple curtain, matter, and the mother of the Lord are linked. Could she expand on this and so explain how the Great Lady can be both spirit and matter?
We don't have the Great Lady as matter any more than we have the Lord as matter. When people came through the temple curtain, physically how they did it, whether they walked around the edge, we don't know. But the temple curtain represented matter, and the area beyond it was the area beyond matter, beyond time, beyond division, and so forth. And whatever being came through that curtain took on matter and thus became visible and part of the material world. So when St. John at the beginning of his gospel says the word became flesh and dwelt among us, he is saying that the word that had existed as part of the great divine unity, the Son, in the Holy of Holies and what that represented. When he came into this world, using temple language, he came through the veil, and the veil enabled him to be visible and to live within the material world. Now, we don't have any, yes, we do. We have the Queen Mother in the royal court in Jerusalem. She seems to have represented the great lady. She was the physical representation of her. She was always known as the Gevira, which just means the great lady. And the queen in the Jerusalem court wasn't the king's consort, because remember, he had many wives and concubines. He only had one mother, and the queen in Jerusalem was the mother of the king. And so you get the vision in the book of Revelation when the child is born and he's set on the throne of God. It's the mother who's the woman clothed with the sun. She's the great sun goddess lady.
Hi, Fishnet. Hi, thank you for your super chat. Absolutely brilliant, amazing insights. God bless.
Oh, thank you.
We'll take this one as the last question, and we'll close. Ryan Quotastic, thank you for your question. Are the names theomorphisms?
Oh, crumbs, that's a difficult question to answer. I don't think I can answer that one. They're more images to help the human mind begin to understand what the great lady is about and what she stands for. If you take them literally, you can't be simultaneously a tree and a river of life and a throne, or the sun. But you can take aspects from all of those, like warmth and light and irrigation and water for the thirsty and all those things. You can take what those images point to and begin to recognize for yourself what these ancient peoples were trying to describe. And they were much better at religion than we are. You know, we've got the internet and all these clever things, but they were much better than we are at the business of religion.
And I'd like to say real quick, before we close, the links to purchase The Mother of the Lord and also The Great Lady will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. So you want to get yourself a copy of those books, they'll be right there, ready in the description and the pinned comment. That being said, Margaret, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, it's nice to do it, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.